It's a foggy morning on Pan Am's District 3, where the powerful BFED lines the switch at the west end of the yard, after just spotting their train within East Deerfield Yard. Once the switch was lined, the BFED continues west ahead of the switch, where they'll back down into the yard and tie down for the day. Once ahead of the switch, the powerful BFED heads into the yard and onto the south pit. Once BFED was tied down, it became quiet in East Deerfield, but not dead, as shop crews are seen moving Main Central 7552 out of the locomotive shops to tie on to the power set that will take 11R west. Pan Am Railways 7552 is a former CSX C40-8. Bought from GE in 2016, the 7552 still runs to this day. But with the CSX Pan Am transaction, the future of her is unknown. Once the power for 11R was set, the power is moved east onto the Berkshire track. Once set on the Berkshire track, we shift our attention to the Ready track, where a pair of B40-8s are seen heading east towards the locomotive shops. As the pair of B40s make their way to the shops, we move to Bardwell's Ferry Road, located just south of Shelburne Falls, where a red signal is displayed indicating that a train is in the block, and that train is Norfolk Southern 16R, with Pan Am Railway's 7875 on the point. From Bardwell's Ferry Road, we move to Wisdom Way, where 16R is seen moving at a greater rate of speed as they head east into Greenfield. Back at East Deerfield, we set back up at McClellan Farm Road when 16R crosses the Deerfield River and stops just west of Control Point 384. Once given the clear, 16R, being crewed by ED4, gets to clear into East Deerfield Yard. While ED4 continues to bring 16R into East Deerfield, we move to the east end of East Deerfield Yard, where the hump switcher is seen pulling cars from this morning's BFED, ahead of the yard where they'll be organized onto their respected trains. As the hump switcher was pulling BFED's consist out of the yard, the weight of the train was too much for its power, and ended up stalling just short of control point 383. Thankfully, with ED4 coming down track R5, the power from 16R can be used to give the hump switcher a shove. With the hump switcher clear of control point 383, ED4 heads back into the yard to tie onto 16R's consist. As ED4 ties on to 16R, the hump switcher begins shoving the consist from BFED into the hump yard. Once the first portion of the consist was secure, the hump switcher then pulls ahead out of the yard and clear of control point 383. As the hump switcher continues pulling the consist out of the yard, ED4 is seen, bringing the head end of 16R's consist out of the yard. Since track R5 is not big enough to support the entire train, ED4 will have to split the train and put the head end on track R7. Once the rear end of the train was secure on R5, ED4 pulls ahead out of the yard and ahead of the switch, while the hump switcher continues to shove back into the yard. As the hump switcher continues switching on the hump, ED4 realigns the switch and will shove the first portion of 16R's consist onto track R7. But before they spot the consist, ED4 needs to set out the cars that are bound for East Deerfield. After that, ED4 will then shove the rest onto R7. Once the cars bound for East Deerfield were spotted, the ED4 then pulls ahead once again to back the rest of the consist onto R7. Once ahead of the yard, the switch is realigned, and with that, ED4 then shoves the rest of 16R onto R7. Once the consist for 16R was spotted, the work is done in East Deerfield, which leads us to the west end where ED4, with 16R's power, heads to the sanding pits to tie down for the day. Since ED4 is on the main, ED4 will need to coordinate with the District 3 dispatcher to cross over from the main to the industrial track, and then ahead of the yard, which is counted for 3 moves over Control Point 384. Once west of Control Point 384, the switch is realigned and the second move is underway, by switching over from the main to the industrial track. Once ahead of the east signal on the industrial, the switch is realigned and ED4 proceeds west ahead of the yard. Once ahead of the switch on the Industrial, the switch is realigned without dispatch. And by that, the day for ED4 is just about complete, as they head east onto the sanding pits. As the day for ED4 ends, the night for others is just beginning, especially for the crew that will be taking EDPO out of East Deerfield and east towards Portland, Maine. Once the switch is realigned, EDPO then heads east to the east end of the yard, where they'll build their train and then head east bound for Rigby Yard. As the power for EDPO heads to their train, the night for another crew is also beginning. This time they'll be taking EDBF, the counterpart for BFED, north to Bellows Falls. Tonight's EDBF is also being powered by two B40-8s, both former CSX, for the trip north, with Vermont Rail 432 dead in tow, after getting a new wheel set during its stay in East Deerfield. switch was lined, EDBF heads out of the yard and ahead of the switch, where the switch will be realigned for their consist that will be taking north. Once the switch was realigned, EDBF then shoves back into the yard to tie onto their consist that lays deep within the yard. Once tied on, the EDBF is ready to go and starts pulling their consist out of the yard and onto the main through control point 384. As EDBF pulls the rest of their train out of the yard, we move to the Greenfield station, located by control point 385, displaying a medium approach for which they'll be following Amtrak for the rest of their trip north. As EDBF heads north into the night, that would conclude our day on District 3. And as always from the Weather Grails, thanks for watching.